Welcome to this explainer. Right now, we're diving straight into a deeply fascinating and highly charged interfaith debate known as the Islamic dilemma. We're going to impartially deconstruct this challenge. We'll be looking at original sources, diving into textual analysis, and examining the historical consensus to see exactly how ancient texts can be viewed through completely different lenses.
Here's how we'll break this down today. First, an overview of the dilemma itself. Then, we'll look at the affirmation of prior scriptures, followed by analyzing claims of corruption. After that, we'll explore the Quran as the ultimate arbiter, and finally, we'll wrap up with the scholarly consensus. Let's get right into it.
Starting with Section 1, Overview, the Islamic Dilemma.
To really understand this, we need to ask our first essential question. What exactly is the premise of this heavily debated theological challenge? Well, as formulated by Christian apologists, the core argument is that the Quran explicitly endorses the Torah and Gospel as authentic revelations from God, yet it simultaneously contradicts their most fundamental historical and theological doctrines. Apologists argued this creates a profound, completely inescapable logical conflict. Let's really break down the architecture of this argument step by step. In the first scenario, challengers argue that if the biblical texts are historically true, then the Quran is demonstrably false because it contradicts that true scripture. Okay, now consider the second scenario. If the biblical texts are historically corrupted, then the Quran is still false because, according to this argument, it affirms and commands obedience to a corrupted book. So the apologists present this as a perfectly closed loop, a logical trap with absolutely no exit. But to really test this premise, we have to bypass the modern rhetoric and go straight to the primary texts. We need to ask our second essential question. How does the Quran historically view those prior scriptures? Which brings us to Section 2, Affirming Prior Scriptures. Passages like Surah 5, verse 46, and Surah 10, verse 94 are constantly brought up in these debates to build the very foundation of this dilemma. Christian apologists interpret these verses to mean the Quran is actively commanding 7th century Jews and Christians to judge by the physical scriptures they currently possess. Their argument is essentially this: if the Quran is telling them to judge by the Torah and Gospel, it has to mean those specific books, in their 7th century form, are considered fully preserved and authoritative. But here is where a really fascinating linguistic nuance comes into play. The Arabic phrase, often translated as confirming that which came before it, is bayn yadehi. It's an idiom literally translating to between its fans. Muslim scholars argue this phrase simply confirms what came before it temporally. So it's acknowledging that an original revelation was indeed sent, but it's not necessarily endorsing, word for word, the physical bound manuscripts held by 7th century Christians, manuscripts which, they point out, already contain textual variants. This perfectly illustrates the crux of the communication breakdown between the two sides. On one hand, the Christian apologist views the Quranic affirmation as a broad endorsement of the biblical canon as we know it today. But on the other hand, the Muslim apologist views the Quran as offering a very specific partial affirmation. It confirms the pure, original, uncorrupted messages given to Moses and Jesus, but definitely not the entire historical transmission that followed. And that leads us directly to our third essential question regarding these ancient texts. Do the Quranic verses ultimately affirm the preservation or the corruption of previous scriptures?
Let's look at Section 3, Analyzing Claims of Corruption.
Christian challengers are quick to emphasize that the Quran directly opposes core, foundational biblical doctrines. We're talking about active denials of the crucifixion, the divinity of Jesus, the concept of the Trinity, and even pushback against the biblical metaphor of God as a father. Apologists argue that these aren't just minor textual variants, these are massive theological chasms, and to them, this renders any supposed affirmation of the Bible highly problematic. A really prominent, specific example utilized in these debates is Surah 4, verses 157 and 158. This text explicitly denies the crucifixion of Jesus, stating it was only made to appear so. Apologists highlight this fiercely. They argue it contradicts well-established historical facts recorded not just in the New Testament, but by secular Roman historians like Tacitus and Jewish historians like Josephus.
So the crucial point here is how the other side views this exact same text. In defense, Muslim scholars argue that the Quran isn't making a historical error at all, nor is it accidentally contradicting a book it claims to affirm. Instead, they posit that the Quran is actively and consciously correcting theological narratives that have suffered from human alteration over the centuries. They don't see this as a contradiction. They see it as a deliberate divine audit.
which logically leads us to ask our fourth essential question. If it's a divine audit, how do Muslim scholars interpret the Quran's role as the ultimate criterion over these texts?
Section 4. The Quran has ultimate arbiter.
This whole concept builds upon a very specific term found in Surah 5, verse 48. The text describes the Quran as a muhaymin. Now, this is a complex Arabic word. Muslim commentators define it not merely as a passive guardian of older texts, but as a supreme authority, a judge, a controller that actively modifies previous scriptures. In this view, it is the absolute standard by which the older texts are evaluated.
And this interpretation is heavily backed by academic research. As Orientalist scholar Nikolai Sinaya observes in the source material, the Quran acts as an unimpeachable standard for the validity of prior texts, utilizing authoritative modification. So, in the Islamic paradigm, if the Bible contradicts the Quran isn't wrong. Rather, the Bible has been corrupted, and the Quran, acting as the muhaymin, is stepping in to issue the final decisive corrective.
Now, taking a step back from the theological arguments of both sides, let's turn to our final essential question. How do secular, academic experts actually view this textual conflict?
Section 5. Sources and Scholarly Consensus.
According to academics like Walid Saleh and Gabriel Reynolds, the critical secular consensus actually aligns with the Muslim apologist view on one very specific point. The text of the Quran does indeed make the charge of textual corruption. The scholarly view is that the Quran does not offer a wholesale endorsement of the Bible. Instead, it consciously reshapes biblical material to advance its own distinct religious claims.
So let's synthesize exactly what we've learned across this entire explainer. Step 1. Christian apologists argue the Quran logically traps itself by affirming a corrupted Bible. Step 2. Muslim debaters reply that the Quran confirms only the original revelation, not the modern canons, heavily relying on linguistic nuances like bayn yadehi. And Step 3. Secular scholars conclude the Quran was explicitly designed to act as a muhaymin, a supreme judge, claiming prior texts were corrupted and in need of active correction.
The Islamic dilemma relies heavily on the premise of complete biblical affirmation, a premise that is strongly disputed by historical linguistics and academic consensus. This leaves us with a final provocative thought to consider. If translation nuances and historical context can drastically alter meaning to this extent, can any single logical argument ever truly resolve centuries of interfaith debate? We highly encourage you to continue exploring these fascinating historical documents for yourselves. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.